there was a moment in the experience that was really, for me, what I felt like was the big catalyst was not that I extracted that chronic pain, but it brought me to this experience of, can you actually just accept your life for what it is? And like you probably understand this a little bit, but like real radical acceptance, not like, well, if I accept it, then maybe something will happen.
Yeah.
But like hands and knees, radical acceptance of, what if this is just your life?
Welcome to High Agency, igniting conversations with inspiring people, leading transformative change. Consciousness-altering substances have long been a part of humanity's journey. Terence McKenna, in his 1992 book, Food of the Gods, proposed a controversial theory claiming that our evolution from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens was in fact triggered by the addition of psilocybin mushrooms to our diet around 100,000 years ago. Psychedelics like psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD, once considered fringe drugs, and having spent decades as criminalized substances, have gained increasing attention in the mainstream with clinical studies that show their promise in treating mental health issues such as anxiety, PTSD, or depression. A 2022 survey showed that 17% of Canadians support the therapeutic use of psychedelics, which reflects a low but quickly growing acceptance to these new therapies. Canada has emerged as a leader in this space, which perhaps isn't surprising that it was one of the first countries to legalize medical cannabis. But as of 2023, the Canadian psychedelics market was valued at around $80 million, with projections reaching $10.7 billion globally by 2027. So this has opened up vast opportunities for startups that are looking to innovate within the psychedelic-assisted therapy market with wellness products or pharma development. And a Canadian company is at the forefront of this movement, providing cutting-edge treatments that have the potential to transform mental health and overall well-being. Enter Numinus. Since its inception, Numinus has grown into a leader in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy with a focus on research, clinical services, and advocacy. Founded by Payton Nyquvest, a visionary entrepreneur with a deep commitment to mental health and wellness, Payton's journey into psychedelics started from his own struggles with chronic pain and mental health challenges. His personal healing experience with psychedelics inspired him to create a company that integrates safe, science-backed psychedelic therapies into mainstream healthcare. And welcome to the show, Payton.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So this is a really interesting story and one that's really dear to my heart. I first learned about Numinous, I think 6 years ago now. And at the time, I had probably read about psychedelics for many, many years. I had had my first experience just a year prior. And we won't start with a confession. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But the timing of everything was quite interesting because I was just coming off of a creative leadership program that I'd been a part of and had the opportunity to microdose with psilocybin and just even learn about this realm just a year prior. And I remember coming back from Amsterdam thinking, like, this is something profound and incredible and beautiful. I don't think I'm done with it yet. And there's something more to be learned and to be done. And within months of that, we met and I learned about the startup Numinous and what you were trying to do in this world. And I covered some of that in the introduction, but what I'd love to hear about is actually digging into a bit of your backstory of what your life was prior to being Canada's largest drug dealer, and how you actually decided to start this company.
Yeah. So I kind of going back, I was someone who was born with chronic pain. And around the age of 12, I had two parents who suffered with substance abuse. And my mom got sober when I was 12. And when she came home, she had, I would say she'd sort of become seen the version of herself that I always hoped she could see for herself. And that was through, this kind of deep excavative sort of mental health process. And she came home, and one of the first things she said was, you might want to start talking to somebody. And I took that very seriously because of my chronic pain. And so about at the age of 12, started really diving deeply into mental health and this sort of intersection of mental health, physical health. And that kind of led me on a sort of like healing crusade, I would say, of everything from going to the Mayo Clinic to working with mindfulness practitioners and meditation, yoga, all of that.
You're doing this as a teenager.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, I think what was interesting in that process also was I was never shy to like kind of share what I was going through. And so as a teenager, I'd be hanging out with my friends, and I grew up on the North Shore and playing hockey and all the things that people in Vancouver do. And I'd, get up and I'd say, sorry guys, I got to go to my therapist. Right. And that was kind of twofold. One, I saw friends who could maybe benefit from some of the stuff that I was doing. But, probably more truthfully is I just didn't want to be the only kid in therapy. So I was hoping that other people were going to join me.
Inviting in others.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And it was profound for my mental well-being, how I was feeling. But my chronic pain kept getting worse, and got to a point about 7 or 8 years ago where I was getting hospitalized probably 3 days a week, and was really kind of out of options. And I'd never had a psychedelic experience as someone who grew up in a family that struggled with substance abuse. I was always sort of like
capital D drugs. You want to stay away from that, stay away from addiction.
Right. And I'd professionally, I'd gone into the finance industry. And so I was even maybe more unique in that, that's an industry that kind of centers around having a good time and using different substances in order to do so.
That's putting it very lightly. We've all seen Wolf of Wall Street.
That's right.
I guess putting it pretty lightly.
That's right. But I was at this point of really, it's interesting with chronic pain in the way that it was showing up for me, which was, within 30 minutes going from feeling fine to rushing to the emergency room. And when you're born with something like that, I had this sort of like existential inquiry of like, am I really supposed to be here or not? Especially in that, with the way that the healthcare system works, is that gets reaffirmed when you go to see a specialist and you think you get close to it, then you find out that that's not the thing. And so I was in this place of like, is my body trying to tell me something that I'm not listening to, right? And I'm kind of a down the rabbit hole kind of person, and so I'd researched psychedelics for probably a year and a half, and finally I was in the emergency room at Lionsgate Hospital, and I said to my wife, I said, look, you got to trust me, but I need to do something pretty different here. And the way my sort of chronic pain presented was gut pain that within 30 minutes would just manifest into the overwhelming experience of pain. And so I said, I'm going to go and do ayahuasca. And my wife in the hospital said, so let me get this straight. Your plan to heal your chronic pain is to go drink a brew in the jungle by yourself with a small group of people. And I said, yep. And so she said, okay. And so I got out of the hospital, packed my bags, and got on a flight and went down to South America and went and did a week. We did 4 ceremonies, and not to paint the picture of a panacea, but 4 ceremonies with ayahuasca, and I came back and I never had any chronic pain symptoms ever again. And that was really, for me, I think the thing that I was really sitting with through that whole process was all of the work that I had done really helped me actually prepare for that experience. And so what it felt like was I had built this fire that, that experience was sort of just like putting gas on the fire. And there was a moment in the experience that was really, for me, what I felt like was the big catalyst was not that I extracted that chronic pain, but it brought me to this experience of, can you actually just accept your life for what it is? And like real you probably understand this a little bit, but like real radical acceptance, not like, well, if I accept it, then maybe something will happen.
Yeah.
But like hands and knees, radical acceptance of what if this is just your life, right? And in that moment, that was really, for me, the catalyst was coming back to that acceptance. And again, as someone, when you're born with it, there's this inherent belief that something's wrong with you, that you're broken, that you need fixing.
And you're fighting it all the time.
Right. And so that gave me, that first real big kind of moment of accepting myself and my experience to date as that, right? And so that was really, for me, the big sort of profound shift for myself. And coming back, though, what I didn't anticipate that was actually far more challenging was I had always, and not just myself, but everybody who was around me, had identified me as like Payton with chronic pain, right? Even from like a time standpoint. I came home and I was like, what am I going to, I always kind of allocated that I was going to be in the hospital at some point during the week. I was like, what do I do with all this free time? Do I get more haircuts? Like, what do I do with all this free time now? And it was really disorienting for me. And it was, in hindsight, one of the things that I didn't probably pay enough attention to was, my relationships with the people who I was really close to, like my wife and my family. I came through that experience and I was like on this rocket ship, and we'd met, not too long after that. And I was like, how do I give back? And what do I do? And Meanwhile, I had this support system of people who, for 30 some odd years, had gone through this process with me.
And they knew you as a particular person,
right,
and that they could manage.
Right. Yeah. And so I come back a week later and I'm like, I'm good. And I'm, now going to go and do all these things. And it took time for those relationships to adjust to that new reality, because they weren't necessarily having the same felt experience as me. And that was I found that very challenging for the first while, because I'm finally feeling this alleviation and all this kind of stuff. And all these people are like, look, we want to trust that, but we've also been the person who sat beside you in the hospital bed for, years and years of your life. And so with Numinous and sort of where that got birthed from was, I came out of that experience, and when I came home, I was really just like, I wanted to give back to something that had saved my life. Like I felt some kind of reciprocity need. And it wasn't to quit my job and start a company and do everything that we've done.
But you quit your job and started.
But I quit my job and started a company.
Yeah.
And for me, what was interesting, going back 7 years or so ago, there was no industry, there was no companies. Really what was happening was a lot of not-for-profit and academic research, and that was kind of about it. And early in my journey, I was fortunate enough to meet some very incredible people. One person in particular, Rick Doblin, who has been the founder of MAPS, who MAPS is really the reason why kind of psychedelics in the West are where they're at. They've been doing research in the space, not for profit, for about 37 years. And when I spoke with Rick, I said, how can I give back? And like any good nonprofit, first thing he said is, well, you could write me a check. But the second thing he said was, nobody's really focusing on the infrastructure side of this. And that resonated really deeply with me, because what was very clear was, yes, I'd had access to this experience, but I'd built so much internal scaffolding and internal and external support to be able to hold that experience. And so while there's so much attention being paid to the experience itself, it was really all that was built around that that made that very impactful for me. And so in starting Numinous, it was, how can we help build that infrastructure so that when these different modalities become approved, they can be held in a way that can actually help support somebody through that process. And so that was and still to this day has been sort of the intention of the company.
And I don't think you can understate what a bit of a leap it was, you know, because culturally, yes, in Canada and some other jurisdictions around the world, we'd sort of gotten over the cannabis thing, right? And so some of the taboo around capital D drugs had kind of, you know, shifted at that point.
Yeah.
And so when the psychedelics conversation started, for one, I was surprised by the number of people that were actually open to it, right? And then the number of people that actually admitted to having, you know, and it felt like a bit of a confession, right? Where people felt some safety now that, okay, we're starting to have these conversations, and now I'm not going to lose my job, and I'm not going to be vilified in society or shunned in some way or ostracized. So I can now actually share the fact that I had this profound experience, right? And even after that sort of initial microdosing and then, you know, much larger sort of LSD full-on journeys after that initial experience I had, it's interesting because this is an incredibly profound experience. It's got incredible health and well-being potential, but there is still, you know, a pretty large cultural shift that needs to take place for it to actually not only be accepted fully as a part of our lives, as a part of our economy, but also to be kind of launched in the right way, right? I mean, as much as I was joking about you being a drug dealer, I mean, there's the OG drug dealers in the room, right? Which is big pharma. And there's a very different appreciation for, you know, chemicals and synthetic products and et cetera in that industry because it's treated a very specific way, right? And you would look at that industry and say, like, why would they actually care about psychedelics? Because it's kind of a bad business model, right? Because unlike opiates, right, or unlike other things that actually are addictive, like psychedelics don't, you know, like it doesn't initiate that same drive. Like you don't suddenly want to come back for more because you need another hit and you're fiending for LSD, right? And so on the one hand, you know, you don't see this actually getting normalized without their participation, but the culture seems so far away from this thing that is actually meant to be a profound and healing experience for people. And it necessitates this incredible social and mental health sort of foundation that you'd actually spent your life building up to that point, right? And so the conversation winds up being so much about the drug, the substance. And we're not necessarily, I feel, you know, culturally anyways, paying attention to how much foundation we need before that, and then what your life, community, society is supposed to feel like beyond that. Right. So how are you guys addressing this at Numinous? I mean, it's a big question I asked. But how are you guys addressing this? Because I don't see how we can actually mainstream a lot of this without, you know, getting these players to participate.
Well, and so one of the things, going back to your first comment around, you know, the sort of confession aspect of this, one of the things that was very shocking to me was when I came back from those first experiences, you know, people knew who I was, people knew a bit of what I was going through. And when I came back, I wasn't screaming from the hilltops about what I'd gone and done, but I also wasn't hiding it. And people started to become aware of that. And, you know, I was working in a different industry, and I started having, on a daily basis, either someone calling me or showing up at my office saying, hey, I have to come talk to you about something. And I became like the confession booth for all these people who are saying, I had, you know, this profound experience and I've never been able to talk to anybody about it. And there was one conversation in particular that really struck deeply with me, which was there was a woman who I'd known since I was a kid, and she was probably 70 at the time. And she said, I really want to come to your office and come talk to you. And I said, sure. And she came and talked to me, and she said, I was in Peru. I was in my mid-20s, and I'd had this, she didn't even know what the drug was. And she said, I actually didn't even know it was ayahuasca until I heard about your story. But she said, that experience that I had was the most profound experience that I'd ever had in my whole life. And it shaped the entire rest of my life. And this is the first time that I've ever been able to talk to somebody about it. And I think it was not even the stigma of the drug, but it was such a profound experience for her.
You don't know where to start.
That she doesn't know where to, and it's hard to talk to somebody about that who hasn't had a similar experience. And it's funny kind of since that, as I've talked with people, there's this conversation that happens where, there's like three words, you're trying to, how do you describe sort of the ineffable, right? But there'll be these sort of like core threads that someone will bring up, and you can see there's like a moment where there's just this like head nodding that happens, and it's like, okay, we don't have to explain anymore. We know what we're talking about, right? And
I think we have that here.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you guys came in, and it was our very first meeting.
Yeah.
And it was me, you, and Stacy. And we kind of went around the table doing introductions, but what was inherent to that was us talking about our experiences.
Yeah.
So there was like that head nod of like, okay, you get it. There's a whole other story we don't need to tell.
Yep.
It's like maybe, it's like a vacation destination, right? Of like, if you've been to the same beach in Jamaica, it's like,
That's
okay,
right.
Yeah.
And so, that for me in the very beginning was really eye-opening. And then, to your other comment, you're exactly right around the container, for these kinds of experiences. And, it's interesting. We're just kind of catching up briefly before this, and we've I think last year we treated about 100 and some odd thousand people. But nobody comes to our centers asking for psychedelic therapy. And I think that's one of the big sort of misconceptions in the space, is that yes, there's all this awareness around psychedelic therapy, and it's become sort of a cultural movement over the last little bit. But most people who come to us, or all people who come to us, they're people with depression or anxiety, and they're coming saying, I need help with this, right? And I think that's going to be the norm, frankly, for a lot of people who are looking for, a more sort of like clinical insurance reimbursed kind of experience, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for us, as much as yes, we provide psychedelic therapy by means that are available to us right now, a lot of our work is just mental health work. And what's been sort of an interesting narrative, particularly in sort of the investment thesis, is, well, not having repeat customers is not a good business, mm-hmm. right? Which is, I think, the most bizarre conversation to have with people. But one of the things that we started to see really early was that people, after these experiences, their commitment to their mental health process and their mental health well-being actually goes up quite dramatically. And they keep coming to therapy, and they keep, engaging with the clinic on an ongoing basis, because they've recognized that, I've really kind of now made some advancement, and I want to stay with it. And I always akin it to, these experiences are sort of like interventions, right? Mm-hmm. And so say I'm someone who needs knee surgery, right? I can approach that one of two ways. I can either say, okay, I need knee surgery, and so I'm going to go downhill skiing and not take care of my body, and then I'm going to go in for surgery, and then after I'm going to sit on the couch and eat McDonald's, and chances of my knee surgery going successfully are probably fairly low. Mm-hmm. Or I can do all the prehab stuff, get my body healthy, take care of myself, go in for the intervention, and then I can take rehab really seriously, and the chances of that being successful go up quite a lot. And that, I think, is really important when we think about these experiences. Yes, there's the opportunity for, great alleviation of mental health challenges, but it's really only as good as, the support that you give to yourself on either side of that. And so I think, that's something that's challenging for our healthcare system to sort of wrap its head around. The way we've treated mental health challenges to date is we put you on a prescription and, that's what you do for the rest of your life. And I think this is also bringing us back to one of the big mindset shifts around mental health that, we've tried to be a stand for is you see so many people who get a diagnosis of depression or what have you, and they start to really identify with it, right? It becomes a part of their, well, I'm a depressed person. And, you're not born depressed. You're, certainly you can be born with certain orientations, but there's events and things that have happened in your life that have made that become more acute, right? And so I think that's a bit of part of this sort of cultural shift in just how we think about mental health care in general. So,
And what is it like leading a corporation with the stated focus of leveraging psychedelics and these alternative therapies and leading the clinical research there? Because you've got a very, I think, interesting place from where like the genesis of the idea was and your intention with it. But then kind of trying to connect that to the fact that you guys went public and you're managing, a publicly traded corporation and you're making moves in the United States. What sort of people are attracted to a company like this? And are there any like unique challenges that come from leading a psychedelics corporation?
Yeah. It's been an interesting challenge for sure. I think, even if you extract out just psychedelics, but you think about healthcare, as you mentioned, we're a public company. The environments that we exist in can be dramatically quite different. And how you sort of culturally stay aligned to your mission and why you're here has, I think, in many ways been our greatest advantage and at times been our greatest challenge, right? You think about, you mentioned pharmaceutical companies and stuff like that. In healthcare, where we want people to get better, right? And then you bring in environments like public markets who, I think people who have supported us genuinely want to support the mission. But as an investor, we want to support the mission and we want to see quarter over quarter growth, right? And a lot of the times in someone's healing journey, those are not two of the same arcs that people go on. And so I think for us, especially as sort of being at the very beginning stages of this, and I think where the sort of psychedelic industry, if that's what you want to call it, has gone to is in the beginning, it was really everybody trying to be all things to all people and doing all things. And I think over the last number of years, I would say the lines have gotten more clear in regards to like where everybody wants to participate, right? If you're a pharmaceutical drug company focused on getting a drug approved through the FDA, that's a very different thing than a service provider who's seeing clients on a daily basis. And so I think that for us over the last number of years has been helpful. But, with that, I think, my sort of referential point has always been my own personal experience, right? And I'm grateful for that. But we've really tried to navigate one, how do we culturally do this in a good way? How do we appreciate that our practitioners work within the healthcare system and the sort of opportunities and limitations of that? And we have investors and stakeholders and all that stuff too. So, yeah, I go back to never losing sight of why, we're here in the process. And, it's interesting, even from the public markets side of things. We've had as many as 50, 60,000 shareholders, and the amount of like inbound emails we get from people who would say, it would always start with like, hey, I just invested whatever amount of money into your company. But then, as we were just talking about, then there would be this like very long confession of
Why?
This is why, right? And that's incredible. And I think, though, with that, the challenge is that all feels really good when everything's tracking in the same direction. But when it starts to go in the other direction, then it's almost like this existential crisis of, does none of this mean anything because now I'm losing money or, what have you. And that's just been, over the last while, again, a very interesting thing to navigate, especially in new industry where things go through these cycles of big attention, big boom, consolidation. And, you mentioned cannabis, which I think has probably been the most interesting example of that over the last little bit.
Yeah, well, I think cannabis has been a great example, and you would hope that in an area that is, frankly, far more profound than what cannabis can do for you.
Yeah.
You would hope that psychedelics leapfrogs a lot of those things, but we saw some similarities, right?
Yeah.
Like one thing I remember thinking about with cannabis, and we had some clients in that space at Skyrocket, was that on the odd occasion you would encounter a client that you could, it's kind of like when your eyes are bigger than your stomach.
Yep.
And from the vision, from the plan, it was like, okay, we're going to buy the farmland, then we're going to set up a processing facility, then we're going to set up distribution, and then we're going to have our own retail locations.
Yep.
And they have this massive vision and the investment to back it, frankly.
Yep.
But you look at it and it's like, farming's hard,
Yep.
right? Processing's hard,
Yep.
distribution's hard, retail's hard. But you wanted to go into every one of these realms and just assume that you would just be expert and just kill it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So what you were saying about really focusing in on what your purpose is and what your mission is, that's critical. But I think especially when it's something new, right? And there's public markets involved, there is a tendency to really blow up the story, and turn into something that might not be as focused.
Yeah. And we struggled a ton with that in the beginning, and nothing will bring in confusion and complexity like money. And it's when I started the company, the intention was actually never to take it public. I'd had previous professional experience in public markets, and I'd left kind of disenfranchised and ready to not be involved in that anymore. And it was almost a little bit of careful what you wish for in regards to, hoping for attention and stuff like that, because what follows that, particularly in Vancouver, is there's, a market trending in a particular direction and a bunch of interest that comes in. And the pressure was frankly looking at the size of the challenge, being mental health care, and the need for resources to go and support that, sort of in many ways sort of pushed us in that direction. And, we were very fortunate. We got to raise, I think we raised about 80 million or so over a couple of years. But that can add a lot of, to your point, maybe over assumption in your own capabilities because people are throwing money at you. And then it's like, well, I must be great at all things because look how much money people are willing to give me. And I think the space in general has gone through an important sort of education process around that. And I think you've seen, as I mentioned, a lot more focus on, what what are the things that we need to prioritize right now, to make sure that there's longevity and real change.
So what are the lessons that you've learned along the way? Because I think the other thing I'm sure there's a lot, but I think the thing that's interesting about your story is how mission driven you were from day one. Because even when we first met and we connected through Skyrocket to help you guys get the initial brand launched, it wasn't that you identified with being a startup founder, right? Or you didn't identify with being an entrepreneur. And in technology spaces where we work a lot, you get some of that identification sometimes, right? Where people know that they're an entrepreneur and they know that they're a startup founder first.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, what do I want to do? I'm going to go figure out how to make a company, right? And I think what was, really authentic to your story was that you were mission driven from day one. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Numinous was your first startup, your first company? Okay. Yeah. So you came out of finance and then you had a mission.
Yeah.
But as a result of that mission, you had to be now a startup founder and go through everything that, comes with being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So what were let's say some of your biggest lessons? I'm sure there were many and I'm sure they're still coming. What were some of your biggest lessons?
Yeah, I think in many ways, naivety is sort of a superpower.
And the bumblebee.
Yeah, that's right. And it was funny early on when I started Numinous. I had an advisor who was someone who'd been in healthcare for a very, very long time. And he said to me, do you know why this is probably going to work? And I said, no, please tell me. And he says, it's because you have no previous experience in healthcare. and I laughed and he said, it's because you're able to see outside of it's cliche, but kind of see outside of the box, right?
Yeah, it's what we call the curse of knowledge sometimes, right? Because you've got all of this knowledge, all these expectations kind of bogging you down.
Right, right. Well, and if you think about healthcare in general, like the process of being a healthcare practitioner, you go to school and the walls begin to
conditioned into it.
Right, right. And so I think, learning in that was, again, I go back to like not forgetting why you're showing up. And the sort of creativity comes from that naivety. But I think, some of the biggest learnings for me over the last while, we definitely went through periods of maybe it was always very clear to me where we were trying to go towards. But having sound strategy and not forgetting to really make sure you're prioritizing things properly. Definitely, I would say it was one of the biggest kind of learnings for me and continues to be to this day. And I think ultimately for us, not forgetting who you're serving at the end of the day. And that, again, fortunately from my own personal experience, like that was always fairly clear for me. But as things get more complex and you start to have many different stakeholders, I think you can lose sight really quickly of, who are you ultimately in service to? And to make sure that you don't lose line of sight of that is I think really, really important.
Mm-hmm. My assumption is yes, but I'm going to ask the question anyways. Do you think you attracted some very culturally aligned people because, again, being a psychedelics corporation, it's a very specific mission of healing and it's profound what you're trying to do. So my assumption would be that you're going to attract some really culturally aligned people, right? Because the story you told of even the retail investors that would buy some shares, but then write you the long email about why they did that. Like you're attracting some very culturally aligned people. So what was it like building a team around yourself? And did you just find that you had this sort of cheat code with psychedelics and as a result, everybody was culturally aligned or how did that go?
We were very, very fortunate in that, we did get a lot of very culturally aligned people, which, there's kind of two sides to that, right? Is you get very culturally aligned, very passionate people. But with that, they come with their own view of things or their own lens of how things should maybe go. And so from an organizational standpoint, how do you bring in and support that passion in a sort of collectively aligned mission? Because you're going to go through periods of, some people will not be happy about a particular direction or thing that you're focusing on at a period of time, and be able to bring that back to, yes, I understand where maybe the challenge with that is right now, but in the broader context, this is where we're collectively moving towards. And so that has been an interesting process to navigate. And how do you foster that over a long period of time as you go through kind of ebbs and flows of, even as we've seen over the last little while, great acceptance, great adoption. Then you've seen the FDA deny things. You've hit, different bumps and things along the way, and not have people get too deterred by that, particularly because this feels new for a lot of people, but really we're doing something that's actually, very, very old, right? These practices have existed for tens of thousands of years in different forms and different kind of cultures. And, even talking about MAPS, who, is a 37-year-old startup who's been doing this a long time. There's a lot of people who have been at this for a long time. And so how do you harness that knowledge? And also, when you turn outward, this is still very, very new for a lot of people, and particularly in the systems that you're looking to, disrupt.
Yeah. So for the most part, you could assume that your leadership team, the people you're attracting, the easier conversation was probably why they're there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But then what you're doing and how you're doing it, there's still lots of room for tension, learning, figuring that part out. And I'm sure that was probably exacerbated by the fact that there's no real, as much as it's, naivety is an advantage, at the same time, there's no real models for you guys to look at.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's not like you're like, well, we have competitors and what are we going to do? Because you're kind of pioneering and breaking new ground for the first time. So what's it been like as the operation has sort of grown out of Canada? And I know you guys made some acquisitions in the States.
Yeah.
What's the activity like there? Because I'm not entirely up to speed with what's happening with the FDA, but I know years ago, MDMA was given breakthrough status because it was treating like 90% plus of veterans that had seen combat and were dealing with PTSD and depression and all sorts of issues. And it had like a 90% plus success rate.
Yeah.
So they got breakthrough status, but what's happened since then?
Yeah. And, it's interesting. So in the US, which the bulk of our operations are now actually down in the US, and you mentioned MDMA, and I think the fascinating thing with MDMA, a lot of people don't know, is that MDMA was actually originally synthesized as a therapeutic drug. There was over 150,000 MDMA assisted therapy sessions that happened in the US before it made its way actually into they've localized it to one Dallas nightclub that sort of then turned it into ecstasy and turned it into a party drug, right? And then, the war on drugs happened and the sort of sweeping Psychedelic Act in the 60s. And previous to that, though, there'd been thousands of clinical trials that had been done. Saskatchewan was sort of the hotbed for psychedelic research. They'd done a ton of research on LSD and all this kind of stuff. And all of that got, swept away. And so in the US, as you mentioned, MAPS and MDMA, they posted 2 successful phase 3 clinical trials treating treatment-resistant PTSD. So these are people who have had to have tried at least 3 other forms of therapy and had not been successful. And the last phase 3, they had 80% of the participants saw a significant clinical reduction in their symptoms. 67% actually no longer met the PTSD criteria, so essentially cured their PTSD, which is incredible. We don't have anything even remotely close to that.
And that's why I was earlier when I was mentioning that it's kind of a bad business model,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Because you want them to have enough PTSD that they keep buying your thing all the time.
And so that's what's led us to sort of an interesting point, even right now, is they got breakthrough therapy status, which, breakthrough therapy status is essentially the FDA acknowledging significant clinical benefit. And the breakthrough designation actually helps them fast track through the FDA process, right? So 6 or 7 months ago, it was sort of like a foregone conclusion that this was going to get approved, and the sort of approval process was just going to be a formality. This summer, what they do is the FDA holds what's called an AdCom meeting, which is essentially a separate meeting of advisors who are not connected to the approval process, give their sort of review.
Okay.
And in the AdCom meeting, they voted down MDMA assisted therapy. I think it was 9-11, or 9-2. So as a group of 11, 9 said no. And not to put on a tinfoil hat, but if you look at the people who are on that AdCom meeting, most of them are pharmaceutical drug executives. And so they'd shot down the submission. They then went to the FDA process, and the FDA has denied their application. And so they're now in a phase of figuring out what they need to do to potentially go to approval. And that has definitely been a sobering moment for the space. And I think, we're at this point of, unfortunately, as you continue to see across the board, it doesn't matter which mental health indication you look at, rates are going up dramatically. And obviously particularly since COVID, but, we're at this point of, we're at a breaking point in regards to mental health care. And then to see that kind of denial is been really hard and sobering for a lot of people. I had therapists who you've got thousands of people who have been trained and sort of oriented their whole life around this approval happening, and now in sort of existential crisis of where do we go from here. And so, I think back to what I was mentioning before, the big sort of criticism of, what the submission that MAPS and a company called Lycos, who's been the spin out of MAPS, there was a lot of sort of judgment around the therapeutic process and things like that, because the FDA doesn't actually regulate therapy. And
it's just the substance.
Well, and I think that's what's been hard to digest is, we're used to like drug taking. This idea of drug plus therapy is tricky to navigate. And so where the lines have now gotten very, very clear, and, one of the things that I said to Rick and the team at MAPS over the last couple of years is, you have to sort of remember also what game you're playing, right? If you're playing the FDA drug approval game, then, as much as we might not necessarily agree with how that process goes, you are in that process, right? And so I think that's where we're seeing the sort of drug approval space at the moment is, what does the FDA want to see? And most of that is like drug safety and all that kind of stuff. The baffling thing, you mentioned opiates. I saw a recent stat that said that I think 1/3 of drugs that get approved by the FDA end up actually getting pulled off of the shelf because they cause harm. That's a staggering number. Meanwhile, we've now got lots of safety data, and there's actually no lethal dose for psilocybin. There's no lethal dose for LSD. Certainly could lead to a challenging experience if you take more than adequately prescribed. But meanwhile, we have a ton of drugs in the marketplace that, cause harm or even death, right? Even Advil. I mean, the amount of overdose deaths from Advil and Tylenol in North America is astounding. And so that's kind of the landscape at the moment. in the meantime, you're seeing a lot of interesting things happen. You've seen Oregon legalize psilocybin. You've seen Colorado legalize psilocybin. So there's sort of different modes of access that have started to happen, which, people always ask me, like, are you more for the medicalization, or are you more for decriminalization? And my response is always just yes, because I think different forms of access are important. But I think, going back to what I was mentioning around, why people end up at a Numinous clinic in the first place, these are things that should be covered under insurance, and people should get, financial support for these things. And so, that goes back to, which lane you're sort of playing in.
Yeah. So what are you excited about next? Like there's a lot of regulation and industry changes that are outside your control. And I think as far as managing a company and leading a company and doing the best with what's in your control, I think Numinous has done some incredible work. And we were happy and honored to be a part of that journey. But where's this going now?
I think there's a couple things that I get that I feel very passionate about. One, as I mentioned, with the mission of trying to support this sort of mental health epidemic that I would say we're in at the moment, is one that's very near and dear to me. But I think the other thing that I've been really excited about, that I've continued to see, is that these experiences have also led people to wanting to live life in I would say a very kind of dedicated and reverent kind of way. And I think you're seeing now, it's interesting in Vancouver, right? We've got dispensaries that sell, mushrooms and 5-MeO DMT vape pens. And, it's like access to the drug has become all too easy. But I think you've also seen a lot of people who have gone and sort of had an experience and have said, that the experience is one kind of small aspect of, what it really takes to kind of walk with those experiences.
Yeah, to truly realize the full potential of it.
Exactly. And I think that, is something that I think is only going to become more important over the next little while. Because, these experiences, and people ask me, should I do something? And I always say, be careful what you wish for, because you can't put that lid necessarily or back on the box. Once you've done that, you can't unsee it or unfeel it. And so, I think as culture starts to support, and talk about more of these things, to also have those people that are really incorporating that in their lives in a way that is, showing benefit not just to themselves but to their communities, is really important, right? And that's, yes, within the sort of psychedelic movement or what have you, but also just in day-to-day life. I saw actually a really great talk. Robert Kennedy Jr. Got asked a question around psychedelics, and he's someone who's been in an abstinent-based program for, I think, 40 years or something like that. But his son went and had an ayahuasca journey down in South America, and he was talking about it. And he was talking about, the experience that his son had, and it was this big cosmic kind of experience. But the thing that he said was, I knew that he'd made a profound change because he started taking out the garbage and washing dishes. And I think that's really kind of what this is actually all about, is how is this actually supporting you on a day-to-day level? And so it's not this like chasing of the experience, but actually how you're taking the experience and then applying it to your day-to-day life. That is really what makes a profound change.
Yeah.
And, even in my own story, people ask me, and, they love the idea of the ayahuasca ceremony or whatever. And
It's romantic.
right. But when they ask me, like, if someone would come to me and say, like, what would you say made the profound change? And it's all the kind of non-sexy day-to-day stuff that I did before that I continue to do today that really makes my life, what it is today. And I think that's not necessarily what people want to hear a lot of the time. But I think more and more people are recognizing the sort of truth of that for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I could have, continual and more and compounding psychedelic experiences that led me to a place where I could file my taxes on time, right? I mean, it's a profound change.
That's right. That's right.
So a lot's happened in the last 5 or 6 years. You've learned a lot. If you had to go back, is there any specific situation or any specific decision that you look at and you say, I would have done this differently?
I think taking the company public, I would say was definitely, and not that I would necessarily do anything different. At the time, it was a new industry that needed capital in order to build and grow. But from an environment standpoint, there's many tenets of the public markets that, is not necessarily a conducive environment to, the journey that our clients are on necessarily.
Yeah, it's a very different culture.
Right. And so, I think that decision and thinking about where we are today is one that I reflect on a lot.
So you might have still taken the company public, but maybe the impact of the cultural implications of doing that.
Yep.
Maybe
For sure.
At the time things were moving quickly. You didn't stop and sort of apprehend fully.
Yeah, exactly. What would be the other thing? I mean, I think to your point and back to this idea of really focusing and, not getting caught up in when you bring on external stakeholders, when you bring on investors, when you bring on, different passionate people about different things, it can lead you down certain directions where you maybe lose sight of why you're here in the first place. And even question, you start to question your own experience or your own sort of wisdom that you've gained. And I think for founders or people who are starting something for the first time, there can be a lot of like running around and trying to get advice or what have you from different people. And I think obviously that's a very natural and important part of the process. But I think at some point you also have to stop and when you've gotten some experience and clarity under your belt, to take a stop and say, and acknowledge the wisdom that you've earned as well, and not discredit that either, because you are the person that's probably been as hands in as possible, and to trust that.
For anybody that wants to learn more about you or the company, where should they go? What can they read?
Numinous.com. We've got lots of resources, education. We post a lot of the clinical trial work that we're doing. We do trainings and obviously the clinic sites. And then for me personally, social media seems to be the avenue that people squeeze into. So just first and last name on social media.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, Payton.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, hopefully we've given you a lot to think about. That was High Agency. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.